On today's episode of the Speak Life podcast, we have a special treat. We have the retired pastor from Second Baptist Church in Springfield, Missouri, Dr. John Marshall, who since he left pastoring has been investing his time in mentoring younger pastors. So he's pulling from a wealth of experience, not only as a pastor himself, but in pouring into others. So we've got some great insights for you today. Welcome back to the Speak Life podcast. So on this week's podcast, thanks for joining us again. We have, now forgive me, is it Mr. or Dr. John Marshall?
You know, Dr. Duvall, it's a great, for history's sake, my only claim to fame is I'm the youngest man ever to earn a D-Min from a Southern Baptist seminary. I was 23.
Oh, how about that? Awesome.
But that I'm pastor. Pastor has been for over 40 years my favorite self-designation. So just whatever you want to call me, it's fine.
Fair enough. So,
in fact, I got my D-Min so long ago. I'm 71 now.
Okay.
I got them when I was 23. So 48 years ago. I can't even remember that. But anyway.
So yes. Let's go with the important title, that Pastor John Marshall, been pastor for years at, it's down in Springfield, and I'm losing the name of it.
Yes, Second Baptist Church.
At Second Baptist Church down in Springfield, right there off of, I'm losing all the names today.
On Battlefield Road.
Yeah, on Battlefield. I should know that. I have a friend who's on staff down there. Missy Vestal is working down there with Children's Ministry and Family Ministries.
Right.
I know she's loving it down there. So it's not only, though, for you that you pastored for years, you also now are very intentional about mentoring young pastors. So could you talk about that for a minute? What exactly you get to do?
Yeah. You know, Dr. Duvall, last Thursday, we have a group that meets in our house. And last Thursday, we had 25 pastors here. And it's a precious group. It really is. We love each other. We know each other. I stay in touch with them by texting, constantly texting, that type of thing. And they love it here. And so I interviewed 3 or 4 of them not long ago and asked them why do they love it so much.
Yeah.
As the 3 or 4 that I really trust and know. It was interesting, Dr. Duvall. All 3 of them at least mentioned at least once nobody else is doing it.
Yeah.
I was totally, when my head kind of went back, I thought, what do you mean nobody? I thought that's what old preachers do. I thought that you preach, you be a pastor, you retire. They said having it in our home, we give them a free meal.
Yep.
We give them, we have a person of means who helps us, and we give them a puzzle for their wives to take home. Yep. We give them gifts. We're good to them. We really are.
Yeah.
And all 3 of the guys said nobody else is doing that. Now, once again, I want to say it again. I thought that's what we preachers do. I just thought we do our thing, we retire, and then we turn around and bless the generation coming behind us. Evidently, that's not as common as maybe I had assumed it would be.
No, I really don't think it is. But man, talk about a need to just invest in new pastors coming up through the ranks. And not necessarily new pastors like they're brand new, fresh out of seminary or fresh in their first pastorate, but just anybody who's in the generation coming behind you, who's hitting new frontiers in ministry and need an opportunity to be able to share with other folks. I think it's hugely important what you're doing, and therefore going to make you a really valuable voice on today's show. And so the couple basic questions we come back to, describe the 2 or 3 greatest challenges you see or have experienced in ministry yourself. And then based on those challenges, what are the top 2 or 3 pieces of advice you'd give to young pastors? And so talk a little bit about, either from your own experience in ministry or from what you've seen in the young pastors that you have the chance to invest in. What are some of the greatest challenges you see?
Guys often are not great at people skills. It's interesting. You can read every book in the world on leadership, and I did that. I read every. Steve Covey, still to this day, I think is the greatest thing in his writings. When I was young, but when I was young, in my 20s, I read Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People.
Yep.
And to this day, all I can say is thank you, Jesus, that I read that book.
Yeah.
some of the guys that I try to help, they are in trouble because their people skills are not good. Like, for instance, we need to teach the younger generation, you never say, I am the boss.
Oh yeah,
If you,
no
if
doubt
you,
about that.
if you, if you have to say that, we have a problem here. They don't know how to go into a room of deacons and just have a pleasant conversation. They come in with their agenda, with what they want done, and then they're
Yep.
offended if they don't get it. And somebody needs to sit down with the guys and say, guys, one of the greatest wins you can have is a loss. To lose is a great win because
Yeah.
people then know, he didn't blow up, he didn't get upset, and they feel free to talk to you. I feel that there's a breakdown in this very basic level of people skills.
Mm.
We train them in seminary, and of course, I believe in seminary. Obviously, I believe
Yeah.
you ought to go to seminary. I believe that. I have the doctorate. I have the just like you do. So I believe in it. But there's an element, a whole world. It's not just a little bit of our job. It's the whole world. How we relate to the old people, how we smile at people, how we arrive early
Yep.
and shake hands with everybody in the building, how we be the last one to leave, how we are present. We touch everybody we see, whether it's on the arm or the hand or on the shoulders you walk by. That, to me, I see that as the biggest gap right now among the guys who are really struggling.
Yeah.
They've read the leadership books, they've heard about what they ought to do leadership wise. They're just dropping the ball on the simplest little things of how to relate to people walking through a foyer, how, in a deacon's meeting, how to deal with it.
Yeah, I tell you, part of what it makes me think through. So during my time when I was at Southwestern, I had the chance to teach a few classes down there. One of the classes I taught was a class called Relationships in Ministry, and it just had to do with exactly what you're talking about, building in those basic people skills to be able to connect with others, to learn how to deal with it when things aren't going your way, to be assertive instead of aggressive or passive. Uh, but loving and extending grace at the same time. And one of the books that I used in that class was a book by a guy named Ron Susek called Firestorm. And
Wow.
that book is specifically about what happens as a church goes from functional to firing a pastor. As they go through, and they just refer to it as a firestorm, and they've got it built out in terms of embers and full blown fire going, and kind of the ashes and what happens afterward. And part of what it comes back to on a regular basis is most of the things that end up leading in that direction for a pastor, it almost never has to do with big significant theological issues. It has to do with people skills. It has to do with the relationships that have been challenged and have not gone well. And so I 100% agree with what you're saying there.
Yeah, I think that's where I would start with some of the guys I'm trying to help right now. They need to know how to just deal with little Miss Smith over here, who's 90 years
Yep.
old, the 75-year-old chairman of the deacons, just how to win. Well, once again, Carnegie, there are reasons why books sell 20, 30 million
Yep.
copies, like How to Win Friends and Influence People. I mean, nobody's probably going to pick that book up and read it, and yet I'm telling you, had I not read that book, my
Yeah.
ministry would have been impoverished.
Yeah.
It really would have been.
It's a classic. It's a classic I'm familiar with. I haven't actually read myself, but I've read books in a similar vein. I've also read Covey's Habits of Highly Effective People. I think is a
Oh,
great
yeah.
book that ought to be read. Uh, but it's one of the books that I used to teach that same class I mentioned a minute ago. It was actually just called People Skills, and it specifically gets at how do you relate to people well, uh, an absolute necessity in traversing ministry. Like you said, from uh, the little old lady who you bump into in the foyer who's got something that she is frustrated about or concerned about, to what shouldn't be big issues but become big issues, like we're building a new annex, what color carpet should we get, that churches sometimes split over because they're not communicating well, and they maybe don't have somebody
Right,
to guide them through that conversation well.
right. Yeah, I agree.
So as you see people skills as one of those issues, what else do you see? What's another issue that you see that pastors need to work on?
I I've been in the ministry 56 years. I started preaching when I was 15, and I'm 71. My biggest regret
Hmm.
is watching the role of the pastor go from that of a shepherd to that of a CEO.
Ooh,
And I'm not talking about CEO in terms of boss. I'm not,
yeah,
but I'm trying to make a statement that it went from shepherd, a ministry position, to now, and I don't know if there's anything we can do about it. I mean, we live in a society. We're incorporated. We're nonprofits. This is just a society we find ourselves in. We have
yep,
to deal with law and structures, things like that. When I started preaching, I had a little New Testament. I carried it in my pocket. It looked like a pack of cigarettes, and I
yeah,
try to win people to Jesus.
yep,
When somebody got sick, I went to the hospital. I met with the deacons to see if there was a problem. I preached sermons. I buried the dead. I married the young.
yep,
It was people. I was a shepherd and they were sheep. By the time I got done, I felt, and I don't think that we pastors consciously made this shift. I don't think we had a choice. I think we got stuck. I think
yeah,
that the society changed, the culture changed, and the organism. I would say that when I started preaching a typical country local church, which is where I started. Obviously, when you're 17 years old and a pastor, you're not pastor of a big church,
right,
a little bitty church out in the country. All right,
yep,
I would say that was an organism. I would say now I have to start from the premise of an organization and work
gotcha,
back toward organism. To me, so that's one thing I feel that the guys are really struggling with. I think they have a calling on their life to be a shepherd, to be like Jesus, to be a gentle soul. But the calling they find themselves called to, they find themselves having to be business leaders, having to make huge decisions, and
yeah,
and they're not necessarily wired that way. That's not really what they're geared for. I find that to be a huge problem.
yeah. So, one of the conversations I've had at a couple different points has to do with that. There's only so much you can fit in to the pastoral training that goes along with an MDiv, right?
That's
And
right.
it's an MDiv, it's not an MBA. You don't have some of the training that goes along with that. Um, some of which is worthwhile, but man, I think about the phrase losing sight of your first love. If you end up transitioning to the point that you're so focused on the organization that you lose track of the basics. It reminds me of, the basketball coaches that we all had when we were in, elementary school, who would just get back to the fundamentals, back to the fundamentals. Uh, some of the fundamentals that go along with pastoring of some of what we're already talking about, building those relationships, investing in
Yeah.
the word, visiting with people, meeting them where they are, and shepherding well. How much do you think that has to
Yeah.
do with the size of the church someone finds themselves in?
Well, there's no doubt that that affects it. When I retired from second was a mega church, and I did have 26 ministers that reported to
Wow.
me. They were, I had 4 or 5 executives, but then basically when it came to staff meeting, you'd have every Monday morning. I met with all the staff, janitors, everybody, everyone came in. We laughed. We
Yeah.
we sang happy birthday. We had tea and breakfast, food. So we built a little community there, about 50 or 55 of us.
All right.
Then we would break down to ministers. Then we break down to executive staff. And by the end of the day, we're down to the top staff. But so here I am as a pastor. I had no choice but to help make sure that we didn't hire a child molester in the preschool
Right.
area, or we find out that somebody has been gambling, got gambling debts, and all of a sudden you better call a lawyer and say, we have a problem here. What are we going
Yep.
to do about this time? So anytime you have to shift to the legal side, to the getting the work of the in-house done, you shift to the organizational side.
Yeah.
And what else are you going to do? In your church, you got 26 ministers who really, if they're great staff members, want to do what you want to do. They want your heart. So they're contacting you. They might only need 5 or 10 minutes. Just Pastor, I just want to make sure I'm going to do this. You think so? That type of thing. But yes, the size of the church does matter.
Yep.
But even at that, Doc, when I walk down the halls, I was talking, I was touching, I was
Yeah.
greeting, I was smiling, I was asking, how, by the way, how's your grandson?
Yeah. Making
And even
contact.
to the staff, as I pray for them, I'm praying for their children, their grandchildren. I'm asking about it. Even in the midst of doing organization, somehow we must find a way to mix in organism. It's got to be a part
Yeah.
of the warp and woof of who we are, that we do it almost without thinking. We do the organization because we have to. We do the organism because we want to.
Yeah.
That's who we are.
Yeah.
It defines it.
I'll tell you what this reminds me of a little bit. So, my background, my training is a lot in the world of counseling, and I teach some courses on counseling here at SBU. Uh, I'll regularly talk with people about kind of four stages that we go through when it comes to counseling with folks. The first stage is the joining stage, where you're building the connection, you're letting them know that you care about them, and it's engaging each other. Do I have what it takes to help you? Do you believe I have what it takes to help you? You move from joining into assessment, and you move really figuring out the problem. You move from assessment into working and actually working on things, and then all the while you're working on termination, helping somebody to get to the place where they don't need you anymore in a counseling context,
Yeah,
right? But one of the things I'll stress is when it comes to that joining side of things, that's not something you just do in session number one. You've got to do that throughout the entirety of the process, not because you want to build a relationship where they're going to keep coming back and paying you for counseling sessions. You do that because it's part of who you are. You care about them, and you care about them not just while they're sitting in front of you and paying you for an hour.
right.
You care about them,
Absolutely.
period. And so you do those things. It's just basic relationship maintenance. Uh,
Yeah,
and I think it's easy
true.
to lose sight of how important that is, regardless of job. By the way, also in your family life outside of your ministry, to be doing that with your spouse, to be doing that with your kids, and constantly
Right.
checking in and making sure everything's going well, just to stay
Especially now,
emotionally plugged in.
why we're watching one of the things that I'm not hearing quite a bit yet that I think is going to come to the more to the front burner soon is the burnout of ministers' wives.
Oh yeah,
I think I don't we're not quite there yet, but I'm about to decide wives sometimes feel their husbands are married to their church, or I think sometimes the pastor does better with the strife than the wife because you'd rather be hurt yourself than see the one you love hurt.
right.
So you're the wife watching your husband get beat up. I think that's going to become a front page item pretty soon. I'm already seeing things like a staff member whose wife may come to church only half the time,
Mm,
or a pastor whose wife slips in just barely in time for church and leaves just as church is over. Actually, afraid
yeah,
to hang out with people. Actually, afraid to walk down the hall, or afraid she's going to see Mr. Smith, who this week said something unkind to her husband.
yeah.
I don't know, that's just speculation. I might be totally wrong, but I think the family thing, the wife thing especially, is going to be coming to the fore pretty soon.
Yeah, I think it goes back to the idea that every pastor's wife, when they walk into a church, that their husband has been hired to pastor, there's an often, I think, usually unwritten job description for her too.
Absolutely.
I think about the smaller churches where it's the classic. He's up there preaching. She's also the one then who's playing piano and helping to lead music beforehand.
Yeah.
Uh, Especially when you talk about that move from organism to organization, and the extras that go along with that for the pastor. It's one thing to say there's only so many things he can do in his seminary training to be prepared for that. She very well may have not done any of that,
That's
but
right.
she's still thrown right into it.
You better believe it. Yeah, I think we're gonna. I think it's going to become more of an issue. I think in our group last week when we had the 25 pastors here at my house, we were talking about is the ministry actually that tough? Is it tougher
Mm.
than just a regular job? We're going to continue that discussion based on this. This essay, this article that's gone viral. This Presbyterian
Yeah,
pastor who resigned, and everybody's talking about it. I sent it to all of them. I said, "Okay, guys, read this. We're going to talk about it. We're going to talk about okay, this is our reality. Now, what can we do to do this and handle this well?" I think that in that discussion, one of the things that kept coming up was family.
mm.
One of them was very, very straightforward and said any other job I could ever have, they would expect my wife and children to act a certain way, even be there, always be under the microscope.
Yep.
He said, if we don't, he's about 35, I
Mm.
guess. He said, if we don't deal with the role of the wife and the children in the difficulty of the ministry, we're missing a major part of why it's difficult.
Yep. Yeah, I think just fleshing that out, the idea that in any other job, uh, nobody has expectations here on how my wife and children behave. Well, I guess my one son, they might, because he's a freshman here and he's signed a code of conduct. But most other jobs, that's not just not how it works, right? And
Right.
it's just unique to that situation. I, I wonder. So one of the things that I always think about along those lines, and this is probably transitioning into kind of the other half of what this podcast is about. It's not just exposing what the problems are, but okay, so what do you do about it? Uh, Kind of continuing on this point for right now, I always think it's important to make sure there's an emphasis for the pastor of what are the things that you're doing to making sure that you're not only investing in your wife, but helping your wife to know that she is a high priority. And I'd kind of like to hear you talk about how that priority works in terms of the priority of your wife versus priority of your ministry, and how those two
Yeah.
go together.
Ruthie and I have been married 52 years. Married when I was 19. Never been a single adult. My mother had to sign for me to get a marriage
How
license,
about
and
that?
so the three of us went down. I got my marriage license. We have had a honeymoon marriage. We have what the whole world. We go to romantic comedies and come home and say we found what the whole world's looking for.
Yeah.
So we've been blessed. But now we had to work at it for that to be the case.
Yeah.
That did not happen by accident. We I'm a typical driven, guy. I want want to succeed like everybody else and go to the top, and so Ruthie and I decided early on. I'm talking mid-20s. I'm talking about 4, 5, 6 years in a marriage, that I would work and come home.
Mm.
That was it. There'd be no hobbies. Not, and I don't recommend that to people. I'm not saying anybody else should do that. I'm not saying that. I'm
Yep.
just saying what I'm trying to say is we made choices together of what we were going to do.
Okay.
We scraped the bottom of the barrel economically and had her stay home as long as we could. And just because, so that when I was off, she was off.
Yeah.
So we desperately worked at figuring out a way whereby I could do my job, but then I could be with her, and my time with her was quality. And
Yeah.
I didn't watch TV. I don't hunt. I don't fish. And once again, I'm not telling anybody else to do that. It's one of the things I've tried to be careful about through the years. Listen to what I'm saying, but don't necessarily do it. Just maybe it's an idea if it'll work for you. But for Ruthie and me, we had to say work and family, period. And that worked for us, especially when she didn't have to work outside the home. If I was off for half a day, she's off. We
Yeah.
do something together. But it's something we have had to work at through our whole married life.
Well, and I'll tell
Through
you,
the whole.
there are two things that jump out at me there in the way you're describing it. One, you worked at it your whole married life. Uh, we lose sight, I think, so easily of the work that needs to go into it. It reminds me of like when you're watching any Olympic sport out there, um, like the U.S. Open for tennis has just been happening. Uh, it's one thing to watch those tennis players get out there and just play these great games, but we didn't watch all the grunt work it took for them to perfect their serve, to be able to anticipate where something's going. That's not the stuff that we watch. It's just the show.
That's
When
right.
it comes to our marriages, it's one thing. What do other people see when they see our marriages? And are we doing marriage in a way? And this is important, so important for pastors, right? To have a marriage that other people in their church can look at and go, that's what I want my marriage to look like. And
Exactly.
that just doesn't come naturally for any of us. It takes work. And I think it's
Yeah.
really
Let me
important to point that out.
let me add to that. If I had it to do again, If I had to do again, since I retired, when I retired 5.5 years ago, I've had 6 interims now.
Mm.
And we learned pretty quickly that, well, people don't even know who Ruthie is. She shows up with me. I at
Oh,
least have got a microphone on.
yeah.
They said, oh, this guy's like
Yeah.
going through the speaker. So we came up to a conclusion. Dr. John Yates and Sharon,
Mm-hmm.
our executive director, he always has her read his text and pray before he preaches.
Oh, wow.
Because a lot of times churches where nobody is. So we started doing that 5 years ago. Every time I preach, she reads my text and then prays for me. Well,
That's
that
fantastic.
has become one of the biggest winners in all these interims. People love it.
Yeah.
I wish I'd done it a second. Now, your wife has to like doing that. You know,
Right.
your wife's an ultimate introvert. She wouldn't want to do that.
Yeah, I know.
But if your wife is willing to read the scripture for you or pray, and then what happens is, without us planning or trying, we'll banter a little bit. I'll say, Ruthie
Yep.
will just say, we're so glad to be here. And John and I have been praying for you this week. And then I might say, yes, we have a little spot down by the river as we drive to get here that we stop and we always pray. So we talk back and forth, and people have seen us
Yep.
kind of interact with each other. I wish to high heaven I would have done some of that back when I was a pastor.
Well, and I love to hear that. I mean, you're continuing to innovate, paying attention to what God's showing you as you continue moving forward in your interims. Right? It's so important to stay plugged in, and I think there's probably something just hiding in that that's worth pointing out. We never get to the place where we got it all figured out.
That's
We
right.
always have to stay plugged in to what the Lord's showing us because there's always something to learn. Uh,
Right.
it's always in place. You know, when you were talking about marriage or a minute ago, that we were talking about the notion of it takes work. The other thing that you brought up that I wanted to just kind of shine the spotlight on for a second is you were making those decisions together. You know, it might not work for somebody else to say, "I'm no hobbies." That's not going to be how we do
Right.
things.
Right.
But to make those decisions together, to stay plugged in and connected to one another, uh, to be able to serve one another in that way is, I think, just hugely important uh, in conducting a strong marriage that's going to last and continue
Yeah.
to build both of you up as you go through ministry together.
I think one of the great temptations is, because we believe the man should be the head of the house, we try
Mm-hmm.
to interpret what Scripture means by that. We're always trying to discern and trying to decide what that means. Sometimes I think that the same mistakes we make in the church, where we come into the deacons meeting and it's kind of think like I am the boss, rather than talking, discussing, building relationships, getting feedback, and a multitude of counselors or safety.
Mm.
I think that one of the things we need to do with our wives is more often say, honey, what do you think? How do you feel? Let's talk about this. Let's really pray. Are you okay with this? I'm more and more convinced, and I did not feel this way 20, 25, 30 years ago. I am more and more convinced that the wife has to share the call. If the
Yeah.
wife, there's no great virtue in a husband making a decision and expecting his wife to obey, or what, I don't know what term I'm looking for, but expect her. So you feel the call to go to this church, leave a city, and drag 3 kids out of school. Well, does your wife feel that way too? We just need to
Yeah.
talk a little bit. By the way, I've been saying for years, Dr. Duvall, you'll appreciate this. I've been saying for years that in the post James Dobson era,
Mm.
somebody needs to write a PhD dissertation on the marriages of William Carey, John Wesley,
Mm.
and Charles Stanley. I've been saying this for years. They're all three. Everybody knows. We're not talking out of school. Everybody
Yeah.
knows. All three of those very difficult relationships. But Dobson almost, the legacy of Dobson almost was family became almost the idol. It almost became
Mm.
God. I hate to say it, like children being gone 13 weeks in the summer
Yeah.
on Sundays, things like that. You think, you kind of throw your back and say, oh, that just doesn't ring true. But the post-Dobson era, family takes a priority. And yet here are three men, three of the mightiest,
Yeah.
greatest men that God ever gave us, who their family life was not that wonderful. I wonder if we've skewed the family thing
Mm.
out of proportion. But at the same time I say that, I double speak and I say you'd better talk to your wife.
Yeah.
I think more and more I believe you need to draw the wife in.
Yeah.
But when you're 71 years old, you've had 56 years to think about these things, and you end up with a lot of questions that
Yeah.
you'd like to have
Absolutely.
answers. Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, even if I think about it, I wonder. So yeah, we can look at those guys and see what all they accomplished. It makes me wonder. I guess it begs the question, in my opinion, if some things in the marriage had been stronger, would they have potentially accomplished even more? And we just don't have a way to know that.
I do not know.
We know that God met them where they were and used them in the midst of their circumstances.
Yeah,
They continue to surrender to what He was calling them to do. So
the reason they matter is because they're three of the most important men
yeah,
that affected us.
yeah,
You know, you're going to have a hard time beating those three men.
yeah. The other thing that occurs to me is, when we're talking about this idea of, how we interpret head of the household, it really harkens back to the discussion that you started at the beginning of our conversation. If you have to walk in the deacon's meeting and declare, I am the leader, it's kind of the same as having to look at your wife and declare, I am the head of the household. Then you're probably not in the way you'd like to be.
Right.
There are probably
That's
some things to work on.
yeah.
So I tell you what, we're pretty much at that time. This has been, I think, invaluable conversation, and I really appreciate you being on here. Are there any final thoughts that you want to share? And with that, any resources that you specifically want to point at that you think would be helpful for your pastors to know about?
Find friends,
Mm,
pastors and ministers. They need friends. They need they need an older guy they can talk to. Once again, I go back to what I said first. I'm
yep.
surprised that not more older guys are mentoring. I, I just thought that's what we do. Younger guys need some guys to talk to. They need to just be able to share some things with. Then, as far as the resources are concerned, I've watched the shift.
Mm-hmm.
I grew up. It was all reading. Now it's all, not all, but podcasts,
Yep.
hearing, people out walking. Very rare you're going to see somebody jogging without earbuds in. Pastors driving down the road, they got the earbuds in. They're listening to sermons and things like that. You have to keep learning. You got to have the relationships, or you're going to crash and burn. You got to have somebody that can look you in the eye and say, "Did you really say that? You didn't mean that. You need to back up on that." You need somebody can really be honest with you,
Yeah.
who's not a part of your church, who it doesn't hurt you to be honest with them. They're not going to come back and bite you. So I feel like that's very important. And then whether it's the podcast or the reading, stay at it. Keep learning. Don't ever quit learning.
Man, well said, John. Thank you so much for being here on the podcast, on the Speak Life podcast. I
Great.
really appreciate it. I think it's been really valuable conversation. For all of you listening or watching, God bless you, and we'll see you next week.